Our next speaker today is another Tim. Tim Raybolt is the executive director of the Association of Recovery in Higher Education. He started off as a conference attendee and then worked his way up from being a student member and a student rep on the board to treasurer of the executive board, an outside consultant, a director for community relations, and now he's the executive director. Seems like he's done about every position possible in the organization there. But prior to doing that, Tim worked in DC as a project manager for a public health research and consulting organization. He's a graduate of George Washington University with a bachelor's in business administration. And then again, he got his master's of arts in education and human development. He's received numerous awards at George Washington, and he was given the award, George Washington Award, for his work in recovery advocacy. Um, but during his time, he also founded Students for Recovery and interned for the White House's Office of National Drug Control. He's been in recovery since April of 2011 during his senior year of high school in Wilmington, Delaware. He currently is in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Tim, it's so great to have you with us today.
Thanks so much, Rob. Appreciate that. I will drop in the chat too my email and then website. So I'll put that at the end too if anything else pops up. But first, I just want to say thank you for having me, Rob, and for the event organizers. I know it's a lot and not the preferred medium necessarily to do this all virtual when you had the great plan to do it in person, but nonetheless, really excited to be here today. And it seems like this topic for this talk is kind of mimics the topic overall for the conference, which is great. The moral imperative for higher education to address addiction. So it's going to be wonderful to dive in. So as Rob said, my name is Tim Rabolt. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the executive director for the Association of Recovery in Higher Education. I saw there's a third Tim on here, so it must be like a quota that y'all had to hit. I looked, I was able to tune in for this one, and I feel like the least qualified Tim on this agenda. So I'll try and keep it moving and engaging so there's something good for everyone to take away from this. I am not in Minnesota anymore. I'm actually back here in Wilmington, Delaware, kind of in limbo. And we are, my fiance and I were moving to California, where I was born. So everything's just, been moving around. Time's kind of flat, but we're moving out there in a month. But currently in Wilmington, Delaware, where, like Rob said, I got into recovery in high school almost 10 years ago. So I'll dive into that a little bit later. Just a quick agenda overview for what I'll dive into today. I'm gonna kind of go right into the topic and talk about that a bit, and then back up and share a bit about my story just to frame the narrative. Then kind of get back into the why. The why of why is this an obligation? Why is it a moral obligation? Why higher ed? Why addiction? Kind of dive into that a little bit more. And at that point, I don't have a PowerPoint. I was going to, but we have this one pager that we developed recently through a grant project just around collegiate recovery. And when I look at this one pager, it kind of sums it up for me. So I thought I would just share that one pager on my screen, and we can look at that. It's just got a few different sections. So I'll pull that up, and then in 30 minutes, hold me to it. I'm speaking it into existence. In 30 minutes, I'm going to stop for Q&A. So everything can end on time, because I know how important that is with virtual with virtual events. So like I said, diving right into the topic, the solution that I kind of think about when I hear the moral imperative for higher education to address addiction, and we'll dissect that a bit, but hear me out. The solution is you all, right? It's folks that are stakeholders, whether it's you're a student, whether you're a professor, whether you're a parent of a student, whether you're in student affairs on campus. I'm going to go out on a limb and assume that because you're in this presentation and you came to this conference, you already know something and have some kind of feeling around this being a moral imperative for higher education, to address. Another piece of this kind of puzzle is that higher ed for so many of us was this really unique period in life where all of our needs were kind of met in one bubble, right? A very small geographic area where everything kind of was. And that's not the same for everyone, but it is the case for a lot of people. And because of that, the aspect of community is so important. I remember far too often when I was a student down in DC at George Washington University, and at some point, again, I'll dive into the story a bit, but I was a graduate assistant when I did undergrad there, and I stayed for grad school. And in grad school, I got to sit in on some of these, staff meetings for student affairs, and the provost would talk about how the number one reason students were leaving, they were citing that they lacked a sense of community and belonging. And so, how that ties in is I really think education overall is a big staple of American society. I think what we're seeing today with the COVID response and students not being in school is that it's a very clear, visible indicator that things aren't necessarily right, right? It's a benchmark where once schools are back in session, students are back in college and elementary school and high school, we have that visible kind of evidence that things are moving as they should in this country. So if we're going to go with that narrative, the argument I kind of have is education is such a critical component in this sense that what happens has a trickle down effect for the rest of society. So, in that sense, things that happen on college campuses have an effect on the rest of the country. So, one of my favorite quotes when I interned at the White House, Office of Drug Control Policy, the director at the time, Michael Botticelli, was in recovery, and I believe this quote was originally from President Obama at the time, but it was essentially, "Your voice has power to change a room." Right? Like if, in a room like this, virtual. So if it has the power to change a room, then it can change a community. And if it can change a community, it can change a city. If it can change a city, it can change a state. If it can change a state, it can change a nation. And if it can change a nation, then it can change the world. So our voice really has power in that sense to change the world. So I love what the previous speaker, Mr. King, was talking about. I wrote some of this down that it was like exactly the same words around. It's essential that we have you all involved as agents of change on college campuses, and I just want to reiterate that. And we're not going to dive too much into what this all the possibilities of what this looks like for higher ed, right? I mean, that's more than a week long conference to dissect all that properly. The research component, overdose prevention, access to services. What we'll mostly dive into, and what I've kind of had the most experience in through ARHE, and my own story that you'll hear about, is recovery, and primarily collegiate recovery programs, which are essentially on campus addiction recovery support services that are kind of like institutionalized and supported by and backed by the university. And so what my argument will be is the moral imperative for higher ed to address addiction starts with the moral imperative to infuse recovery on campuses. And what better way to do that than an actual program on your campus dedicated to recovery. So all right, so at this point, maybe you're bought into higher ed having the power to make this kind of like seismic shift in how the country addresses addiction, but you might not be fully on the, maybe you're still on the fence around, is this the best use of time for higher ed? There's all these different things to focus on. So I want to read this quote from Stat News 3 days ago. Among the unrelenting death statistics flowing from the CDC last month, one grim non-COVID-19 statistic stood out. 81,003 deaths. That's the number of people who died from drug overdoses in the 12-month period ending last June, a 20% increase, and the highest number of fatal overdoses ever recorded in the U.S. in a single year. So, if that's not compelling enough, and there's a countless kind of statistics and numbers and data we can pull to kind of look at why the moral imperative is there. But I would gather that folks in this space know that, right? You're connected probably in some way. You'll hear from all these different speakers throughout the day and kind of build this case for yourself. So quickly, I wanted to give my story because I think it's it's definitely a story of privilege, right? Like I had access to education and access to care that other individuals from certain, marginalized communities do not have the same access to. Like the system very much was set up for an individual like me to benefit and not struggle as much. So I'll preface it with that, but it is a very average story in other ways of how things kind of came about. And then I'll dive into more about collegiate recovery specifically, and share that one pager. So as we talked about, I got into recovery here in Wilmington, Delaware, in high school, and on paper, everything was kind of proper. It was right. There really wasn't much to kind of complain about. Good school, good family, good dynamics. Um, it was great. I didn't have a lot of very large life obstacles. There wasn't a huge genetic factor. The environment was solid, and what happened in eighth grade. We were talking about the adverse childhood experiences. But in eighth grade, I got kicked out of school, a very small school in a small state in a small town, where again that community piece was shattered. At the same time, my parents got separated, and then there's all the feelings that kind of come with that. Like, is it my fault? And so there's this feeling of inadequacy that starts to develop, as a result of that trauma. That when I switch schools and I gravitate towards drug and alcohol use, those feelings go away. And of course, in the beginning, it's this period of euphoria. And as you all probably know, at some point that switches. And towards the end of my time in high school, it was not euphoria. And it was just to be able to have the confidence to get out of bed or walk out of the room or get in the car or sit in the classroom to do anything. And it kind of culminated with this Super Bowl party where, again, on paper, everything should have been great. Senior year, Super Bowl, the Eagles weren't in it, so I was bummed, but it was still good. And I was miserable. I was in a room with all my friends and felt like the only one there. And that's a deeply sad feeling that I couldn't even cry through because of what was in my system at the time. And um, I went and I talked to a teacher who got me some help, and I finished out high school my senior year like in outpatient treatment and graduated on time. And I was riding this kind of pink cloud, right? And I get down to college, and I thought that all these individuals in recovery were just going to be waiting for me, like arms locked, welcome Tim. And it didn't happen like that. And I went to talk to someone who seemed like they should know about recovery, just based on like their job title, something like drug and alcohol education. And they looked at me like like I was speaking a foreign language. Like I think they knew what they just associate like recovery with AA. So they're like, yeah, we can point you to some meetings, but that really wasn't what I was looking for. I had no idea what collegiate recovery was, but I absolutely knew that from the little bit of time I had, that I needed to find a community of peers, like people that I could identify in with. And what proceeded to happen over my time at GW was a roller coaster of emotions. In the beginning, I witnessed, and throughout the time, really, countless students drop out of the university entirely due to drug and alcohol use. And I'm going to bet that on their withdrawal forms or transfer, paperwork, that they're not writing addiction on there. And so it's not even counted. Like we don't even really know how many students are actually leaving because of that. I'm sure there's some good guesses out there and estimates and surveys, but I mean, I remember just students that came to our meetings over the years and then fully left the school. I remember it was dozens. I feel like the number was like 40 to 50, which is wild to think about. I mean, GW was a solid sized school, like 25,000 students, but think about the value to the school if those students stayed and did well and were engaged and got support that they needed. It just seems like an obvious, right thing to do from a business standpoint, yet alone the moral imperative. So anyway, one student in particular, we became closer than I ever could have imagined with a human being. And on October 10th of 2011, I picked up my 6-month chip and he picked up his 30-day chip. And we came back to our dorm as freshmen, and the other students kind of in our cohort were there, and they clapped for us. And that was such a inflection point where I saw the power of not just supporting students in recovery, but what the microcosm of a culture of recovery and the impact on the rest of the community. Having recovery allies involved, things like that. So that student ended up returning to use and had a lot of other things going on that made it increasingly difficult for him to stay enrolled, and he left probably in November. And I proceeded to get to the worst point in my entire life, with almost 9 months in recovery, like sober. My bottom was with coming up on a year, because of it just felt like everything that could be going wrong was going wrong. Now in February, 3 months after this bottom, the administrator that I kind of originally talked to, that also worked with the student, gathered a bunch of students in recovery on campus. It was like February 9th, 2012. Like, I'll never forget being in that conference room. And what was cool about being in DC and everything is, like, we had folks from like the White House and like these different government agencies that were in recovery show up to that first meeting. That feels like a pretty unique kind of circumstance for the first meeting of students in recovery. And from there, it just felt like a missing puzzle piece. Like, I was going to meetings and really connecting with folks in DC, but it's different when it was the other students on campus. And so, like, when we dive into collegiate recovery, like, that's such an important piece of it. Like, it really boils down to, support, staff, students, and space. Like, we'll dive into that and you'll see it on the one pager. But, you know, at that point, I finally had the student piece, right? The other students. In that moment, I also, we met in that room a few more times. It started to feel like I had the space. Um, we had staff that helped put it together, so we had that. And just by being with other students and having a recovery meeting, it felt like support. So it was a great step. And that group turned into a student organization, and that student organization turned into a collegiate recovery program. And over time, I think we peaked at maybe like 30 or 40 students that were in various kind of recovery identities. And we did all sorts of fun stuff. We got like free tickets to go to the Nationals games, the baseball games in DC. We got to go on like White House tours. We did retreats. We got a townhouse, the ground level of a townhouse called the Serenity Shack, where we had 24/7 access for students who were involved. And we would watch, have sober Super Bowl watch parties and have multiple recovery meetings and art sessions. And why it was so unique was that it was a college recovery experience within this larger college experience, and that was the only way it was going to work for us. It was definitely the only way it was going to work for me. And there's these moments over that stretch of time where students would pull me aside, like if I hosted something in my apartment, or something, and they would be like, I don't know, where I'd be without this. And how do you capture that, right? Like, how do you explain that to an administrator, like what that is? Because, like, like, I know what that student was saying, because I had the same exact thing. But how do you like capture that in a way where universities understand it's not just a student org, right? It's not something to just like pat on the head. It's something that actually needs to be addressed. And I really think that, over time, universities are going to recognize this. Um, I think they'll look back and wonder how they let this, slip. So, at this point, you might be wondering a little bit more about collegiate recovery, and I'll get to that in a moment. I got through GW, like the bio kind of covered it. I stayed in DC and did some consulting work at a public health and research firm called Altarum, and then about 3 years ago, I joined ARHE full time, and so we're a professional membership association, a nonprofit. And we represent all stakeholders of the collegiate recovery movement, mostly the institutions. So we have about 140 member institutions. That first meeting in February 2012, so 9 years ago, we had 14. And I'm the only full-time staff member, but we're working on kind of growing, and we have so many volunteers, and it's an incredible field. And so if you're wondering about this a little bit more, the good news is that like a ton of this information is just out there for free, and the folks in the field are of service almost to a fault. It's a big component for big kind of aspect of recovery and recovery programs, not just 12-step, but anywhere of being of service, kind of getting out of yourself. Um, so these folks are always willing to help. I'm willing to help. You can email me at any time. I'll drop that info in there again. You can also come to our conference. It's in about 4 months, the National Collegiate Recovery Conference. I'll have about 1,000 attendees, so you can learn about that on the website, collegiaterecovery.org. We have a pretty generous and flexible scholarship and discount application because it's difficult right now with COVID and everything else, and budgets being tied up. And what I want to wrap up with for the remaining kind of 10 minutes before we dive into Q&A is the one pager that I was talking about that really kind of captures collegiate recovery in my sense. So going back to the topic, moral imperative of higher ed to face addiction, just want to reiterate, like, I think the moral imperative starts with an obligation to infuse recovery throughout your campus. And like I said, when applicable, collegiate recovery program is a great way to start. Rob, I'm not sure if you're able to give me share screen access, if that's possible at all.
You should have access now, but
Yeah, still says host. Oh, here, yeah, it just came up. Okay, so let me. All right, hopefully folks can see the document on the screen now. It's always tough especially with the Zoom webinars, you can't get any feedback, but okay, Rob, give me a thumbs up. That's good enough. So let me move the screen over just because all the Zoom settings are in the way. So, this is the top part, and I'll scroll down a little bit, but at the top, that vision, this is from ARHE. So that's our association, again, that represents collegiate recovery programs, the schools that have collegiate recovery programs, staff, students, other supporters. So that collegiate culture that embraces recovery, that's kind of what I'm talking about with the moral imperative starts with infusing recovery on campus. Because again, when you look at all the different options, and at least what I've seen, which my experience may pale in comparison to what some of you all have, but I've definitely been able to visit a whole bunch of campuses and seen what happens, and I just feel that the kind of chain reaction and direct and indirect benefits of starting with this culture of recovery does a lot more than other programs that I've kind of seen, because again, it builds it into the fabric of what the university is doing. It's not just a week, it's not just a day, it's not just some trending thing until students stop talking about it. It's part of the the day-to-day life. So I love this quote. This quote we put in there from Austin Brown. He's a brilliant mind. He's contributed a lot to recovery research and collegiate recovery research. This quote says, "To truly promote diversity on college campuses, colleges and universities must have initiatives that recognize and support students in recovery." So again, all that kind of ties together. This chart over here, this is our ARHE membership growth, and you can see this must have been towards the start of 2012. We were founded April 15, 2010, incorporated in 2011. And, I didn't get involved really kind of more towards here when I was a student rep. So I'm not sure exactly what, membership first started here, but this is kind of the, what we're looking at for our own membership growth. In terms of overall history, Brown University is frequently cited as having the first collegiate recovery, program or community back in the 70s. Texas Tech and Rutgers have been around for over 30 years, and Augsburg University is pretty close as well up in Minneapolis. So the history is there. The rapid growth is definitely within the past decade, though, and there's a number of things that have contributed to that. The opioid crisis, definitely a bit, in the sense that state money has skyrocketed. There's probably about 10 states that have dedicated state funds to collegiate recovery at this point, which is great, including a lot right down where you all are in West Virginia, North Carolina, Virginia. It's been really great to see that happen. So that's just kind of our growth over here. It's a little bit around the terminology. When we talk about collegiate recovery program or collegiate recovery community, the field kind of has used those interchangeably, and it's mostly because different schools have called their offerings or their programs or their groups one of these, and so they're just kind of been used interchangeably in that sense. But what we're trying to move a little bit more towards is, if a program is different than a community in a very literal sense, right? Like you can have a community without having a program, and you could have a pretty bad program that has no, because it has no community, So a great program and, great community kind of go hand in hand. But, these are kind of the, pieces that kind of, make or break it in that sense. And then, the kind of best practices or key components that we talked about earlier, you know, space, staff, students, and support is what it really boils down to. Is, I kind of gave that example of my own story. um, and why these are important. The space component, no matter where you go on college campuses, you're met with drug and alcohol use. You're met with things that are far opposite from a lifestyle of recovery very often, including in your own dorm, in the library, in classrooms. I can't tell you how many times I would get up on a Saturday, go to a meeting, and you could smell weed in the hallways. There's beer cans and all sorts of trash in the stairwells. Um, you'd come back at night maybe from a meeting, and there'd be frat parties, and you go to the library and people are talking about study drugs and passing things along. It's just everywhere. So to have actual dedicated space for students in recovery is key in that sense. The dedicated staff, it shouldn't be on the back of students. It just shouldn't. It's great if they want to have a student org and have some independence in that sense, empower them to do that. But it shouldn't be on the back of students. And we also know that students are not there forever. I was able to stretch out my time at GW, but that was more so because I had a little crisis trying to figure out what I was going to do with my life after I spent years working in sports, and then went to the first collegiate recovery conference, and I was like, that's what I'm doing. So, putting it on staff and having it institutionalized makes a whole lot of sense. The programming and different things supporting recovery, and that doesn't just look like meetings, right? There's the social aspect, things that are building the community. um, you know Programs offer like seminars, so they have this academic um, component, different kind of like bonding activities, different ways for everyone to stay connected. Right now it's very tough, but some folks are finding success with like game nights, things like that. And then the peer support and support in general, is a key component. Over on the left, this is, I mean, this and the return piece on the bottom right. I mean, this is the case for higher ed. So the moral component, it's just the right thing to do, right? Like it's the same as so many other student populations that are receiving services because of the nature of the population that they are, whether they're first generation students, veterans, students with other disabilities, things like that. And one thing I will say is that you can Google addiction, ADA, individuals in recovery, not just using drugs and alcohol or battling addiction in the current day, but in recovery meet the ADA requirements for a disability. So who knows? At some point, I would not be surprised if there's some kind of lawsuit that brings that to a much higher level, and then I think universities won't have as much trouble understanding the moral imperative at that point. But anyway, 5 more minutes. So the student success piece on the left, this was a study done by Dr. Alexander Lode, where she looked at 500 students in recovery in programs. So I want to make that distinction. It's not just students in recovery in programs across about 30 different institutions. And I mean, that's pretty compelling to me. The higher graduation rates and retention rates. And these rates, how it was phrased in the survey was, uh, it wasn't defining necessarily 4-year graduation or 6-year graduation rate. It was kind of phrased broadly, so it was up to the institution specifically. And then that piece on the bottom, students involved in CRPs collectively also had higher GPAs than the general student body. So if you look at the opposite, right? So you have students in recovery in these programs who have better student success metrics compared to the average student at the school, graduation, retention, GPAs. Think back to what I was explaining with the students in my school who did not have the support that probably could have ended up in these graphs right here, and they left the school. So you can infuse recovery and have support and retain students at a higher mark, see them be more successful. One also a piece that wasn't in this chart is that students in recovery were of service so much more often, giving back. Penn State, I always love this story. They have this huge award for service, community service, and I think like 4 years in a row. Mind you, Penn State's a huge school. 4 years in a row, a student in their program received the award. I think that's just incredible, to capture that students in these programs are really what schools should want. And if they aren't doing this, the students are leaving, or worse. There's other outcomes, with the statistics I brought up earlier. There's other outcomes that are even worse, so the moral imperative starts to become pretty clear in my mind. And then the return piece, we talked about engaged students become engaged alumni. Thriving students equates to further problems and lower costs. But look at that stat at the top. CRP has reduced the recovery and relapse cycle by 15 years. And so it's easy to look at numbers and not understand what that actually looks like. But this is comparing the average addiction life cycle to students who are in these programs. They're drinking and using around the same age, right? 13, 14 is their first drink or drug use. The difference is students in recovery in these programs, the first average treatment episode at age was 21. For the average individual overall, 31. And it was taking the student one treatment episode. And they were getting into sustained recovery at age 26 on average. For the average individual, it was not until 41. 26 years old versus 41 years old for sustained recovery on average. So it's easy to say 15 years, but think about how many students we're talking about, and think about what those years involve. 15 years of healthy, educated, productive, happy citizens and alumni versus 15 years of battling this without support. What else might happen in that time? And if schools know this, do you really want to be the ones to not do everything you can to get the 15 years in the positive and get these students in the charts over on the left? So, for me, that it starts to become pretty clear in that sense, when you look at it and kind of put everything, all together. So, I just want to say, like, again, the moral obligation, it falls to us. Our stories have power, our voices matter. We can be the ones to enact change, like Mr. King was sharing earlier, and we can move things forward, not just for the benefit of students, but for all of society as well. So I thank you for inviting me today, and I look forward to some continued conversation and seeing where everything goes. And it's 10:35 on the dot, Rob. So kept my word. Thank you all.
You spoke that into existence. I just appreciate that. What a great, very visual presentation there to help us. Really important. So just to everyone who's listening, we will get you that. We'll send you that one pager so you can see all those things also. But question, you talk about GW, you talk about Penn State, really big schools, right? So if I'm going to get into a recovery program, in a small school, maybe 900 or 1,000, maybe what about my fear of being, outed, or I don't want people to know that. What's been your experience on small campuses?
Yeah, so we're actually working with two schools now that are under 500 students. And so, yeah, my previous kind of experience prior to that was, Augsburg was only, 5,000 students or so, and they had, 100 students in recovery in their program. Granted, that's over quite a bit of time, but that's why we try and push the narrative more of building community, and not necessarily trying to dive right into a program. But students in recovery are there, and sometimes more prevalent at the small schools, for reasons that I won't pretend to fully know. But I think a lot of schools that have done some surveys on how many students on our campus identify as in recovery, or how many students on our campus would like support services for recovery from drug and alcohol addiction, or things like that, and they seem to get around like 2 or 3%. So might sound like a small percentage, but even with a school of 1,000, it adds up a bit. And again, that's why I think the community piece is important, and really looking at like what you want to do. Is it um, just for students? Do you want to engage alumni and faculty and staff? So I think that piece comes up, and then your question on for someone who's afraid of being outed, I'll assume that's like from a student perspective. I think it's kind of on the staff to provide the resources and work with the student kind of where they're at. I think a lot of students will gravitate to exactly what you were saying, Rob. Like they might not want to be involved with anything where their name is public, and they'll just stay in 12-step meetings, and they might be just happy with that, and that's okay. Um, I, personally, I would challenge folks a little bit, because I think they, as well as others, will benefit more if we are able to, speak up about this, and not to put pressure on anyone to do it and grab a microphone and be screaming about it, but to come and sit in another room and be like, yeah, I'm a student, and I have 3 months, and what that does for the student next to him that has 3 days. You know.
Yeah, that's a powerful reminder right there of just the collective, just seeing other people. I have a question. What is your experience with like collegiate recovery housing or affinity housing of people who are living together in recovery?
hmm Yeah, it's worked so different on so many college campuses. I've heard just a pretty wide variety. I feel like what I see the most often is it's a pretty small percentage of the overall program. And what if a school asks me in general, like, what should we do about recovery housing? One, I would tell them not to start there. I just don't think that's helpful. Two, uh, it's really dependent on how your kind of housing is set up and how residential your campus is, things like that. But three, like the primary piece that was helpful for me was staff working with students case by case on what kind of lodging accommodation is going to be the most helpful for their recovery, because there might be a student whose best case scenario for them is to be right in the thick of everything on campus, even if it means a ton of drug and alcohol use. But they might feel that, I don't know, their recovery is strong enough. And that's what, if they're not a part of that, they might feel isolated. And that might actually contribute more than witnessing what's happening. And then on the opposite extreme, there might be, a student who has to live with other people in recovery, and figuring out how to make that happen. Even if it's just in a quad, room of 4 people, and get 4 people in recovery, and um, help them out. But for me, I was on there's 2 campuses for George Washington. There's like the main campus downtown, and then there's one kind of tucked away. And I thought that was going to be great for me, the quiet. And it was that opposite feeling. Like I felt so isolated, and I could not move to any open spaces on the main campus. But the administrator helped me get into a dorm that was just for sophomores, with a really quiet, guy who was great for me in terms of getting through my freshman year. And then, the second I was exempt from university housing my second year, I got into an apartment on my own. And that was the best. So I think it's about working with individuals where they're at. But yeah, someone can definitely email me if they want to talk to like specific schools that have housing. Like Texas Tech is great to talk to, Augsburg, Rutgers, Penn State, Ohio State, some of the schools we've talked about. But I think a lot of times they end up going with either like a section of a dorm, or a townhouse, and keep it kind of low key. It's a lot of policies and procedures to have in place. It's a difficult thing to take on. I think you see more sometimes schools look at Rutgers and Augsburg with entire dorms essentially for recovery, and think that that's what they have to jump to right away. And it took a while for them to get to those points. But yeah, it's a great thing to be thinking about.
So when a professor was thinking about kind of starting a program like this, or even building a community, what advice would you have for them to like speak to the administration?
Yeah, what we did as students is we built a kind of like dashboard like one page type thing. It almost looked like the one I was sharing, but it had, some timeline, excuse me, milestones for us specifically, our group, and how many students were involved. And we compared it to market basket schools. So we compared it to what the competition was doing. Um, Not a fun way to do it, but it opened the the ears of administrators a little bit. I ultimately think if I had to boil it down to like one piece of advice to talking to administrators is hit on the actually I've never said it this way. I'm trying to figure out how to say it in a way that'll sound memorable. The heartstrings and like the purse strings or something like that, like get the component that gets them to understand why it's so important, and then the part that gets them to understand the bottom line impact. So what I would do, I would try and get key individuals who could share their stories, or share impact and share something that gets the administrators to understand the why of what we're trying to do, and then share some of that stuff. I was just share this one pager and show, you can show the member map on our website, like how many programs there are. That always seems to open some eyes. And then you can share those student success metrics. Like you could frame it that way, like this is a student success um, optimization initiative, like something like that. But it's definitely tough to speak administrator language sometimes when for us it becomes such a clear thing to do. So I think that personal side, business side combo does pretty well.
Yeah, the language of retention, like you say, is really helpful, right? It's if students are um, more likely to sustain and be there. Question for you about if a school doesn't have a program,
Mm.
right? What steps would you say are kind of first steps? And then also, if a school is going to hire a facilitator, right, for something like this, is there like an organization they would go to try to find facilitators at, or what would be your recommendations for that?
What's the facilitator piece? Or like a meeting facilitator or a staff member?
Yeah, like if you were going to find like a facilitator or a program coordinator to say, hey, we're going to start this initiative.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So as far as starting points, I would definitely start with kind of like thinking a bit about what exactly you might want, and the why, and kind of breaking that down a bit. I would also start by just kind of being a sponge for a bit, and absorbing some of the resources that are out there for free. So you can hop on our website. Like we're getting ready to launch this kind of resource hub that compiles all these resources together in a free place where folks can download them, and things like that. Um, Talking to similar schools that have programs already, I think, is a great place to start. We have a whole YouTube channel of all of our webinars that we do for free. There's like 30 of them on there. You could, watch some of those, but I would just absorb a lot of the information to figure out what exactly, you know, you might want to do. And then again, I think it makes a whole lot more sense to focus on community building for first rather than program building, because I think some schools start with program building and then they're like, okay, now it's time to build the community, and once that goes slower than some people want, then the program kind of falls apart and it doesn't have the backing as much. So I think it's easier to get program and infrastructure support, especially financially, when the community is already there. It's kind of like proof of concept, like, okay, this is something that's going to work. So, I think some key things are like figuring out how many students in recovery are there. Like where are, like what we try to do is think about everywhere that a student would end up that was going to need what we were doing, recovery support. So, they're going to go to their professor, they're going to get in trouble with judicial services, Greek life, disability services, all these different places, and think about like how can we not be like a referral source, but like how can we put our safety net in there? So I think some of that initial stuff makes sense. And then as far as the recruitment component, from I think there's general higher ed sites you can kind of post on, but I think what's most common for us right now is folks will send it across our membership listserv, for folks who are members of ARHE, and then we're always able to post anything up on our kind of career corner webpage. So I think that's where, a lot of folks in the field at least tend to find out about other offerings.
Great. What would you say, if you already have an established program or group on campus, particularly a group on campus, but it's really small, other ways to recruit others to join the group, and if you could explain just a little bit more about the distinction between community and program.
hmm Yeah. So the if you just have a group of students meeting and they're doing stuff, like that's a community, right? Like just in a very literal sense. Uh, you have a community there, and you want to like grow that community. The program is more of like the infrastructure support provided by the university. So that's like actual policies and procedures. Maybe they're applying to be a part of the program. Maybe there's priority registration or scholarships attached. Maybe there's social outings, travel, study abroad, dedicated staff that run the actual program, space provided for that program. So that's all the pieces that scale it out a whole lot more, because at some point you can have a really solid community, but in terms of sustainability and getting those individuals the help they really need, probably need some kind of program at some point to really do your due diligence, I guess, in that sense. As far as the I'm trying to remember the first part of it, where to gather the other students. Again, I think it kind of depends on what exactly you're I want to say like looking for, but okay with, because some schools, the different ranges I'll give are: we only want students in recovery that are part of 12-step programs. I would not recommend that, but that's what, some schools end up doing. And if it works for them, who are we to, say? I think there's a lot of students that are probably missing that way. Then the other side of things is we are open to any, recovery is anything. Everyone's in recovery. We're open to students, other students from other schools, alumni, parents, faculty, staff. And that, yeah, it's just kind of so broad, so kind of figuring out where you are in there, right? Like, do you want to have alumni involved? Do you want to have other students at a nearby school involved? And then not necessarily defining recovery, but setting parameters for what you're looking to support mostly, if that makes sense. Most of our schools are supporting students in recovery from drug and alcohol addiction, but there's students involved in most of these programs that, you know, um, you know, not a huge percentage, but might not necessarily identify that way, or they have other issues that they're receiving support from, and different things like that. But the most common is that sense. So I think defining what exactly your population is will help, and then figuring out all the places to get to them. Having a social media presence, getting your information in a newsletter from your university. Like, just think about, put yourself in the shoes of your population. Where can they hear about you? And then get that information there so they do hear about you.
You know, supporting recovery on campus, there's some schools that really talk about that a lot, and then ironically will host booze cruise for seniors, or come to the football game, and for alums, and there's alcohol. What do you say to that, what feels like a glaring contradiction?
Um, yeah, I mean, if I think it'd be easier to digest if there was like a very clear action oriented culture that supports recovery provided by the university. Like, what I mean in that sense is, how does student affairs talk about social justice and holistic health, and we have collegiate recovery presence on like 1% of schools. Like, it just doesn't really add up. And I get it. It's not, schools have a lot of funds, but it's not just sitting around. And for the most part, we have a long ways to go in getting them to understand what we're even talking about. Because, you know, here's very common interactions. We talk about, the need to support students in recovery. So they hear we need to support students who are battling addiction. And their response is, we don't have those students here. Okay, so there's some work we got to do with those folks. Then there's the response of, okay, we need to support students in recovery. Their response, yeah, we have a counseling center, and I think there's an AA meeting like 20 minutes away. So like they don't understand exactly what goes into supporting students or we're talking about. And then a third one is we need to support students in recovery. Their response, yeah, but if we do that, then we need to support this other student org, and then we have to give more to this student org and this Greek chapter and this new student population, things like that. So it's a lot, and it's going to take a lot to kind of get them to a point where they are at with other student populations that they don't really you know blink twice about. So we have a huge battle with, I mean, yeah, you can call it stigma, but it's discrimination. So there's a lot to do there. I'm not sure. I hope I answered the question in that sense.
Yeah, I think it's a helpful distinction to talk about discrimination and use it in that line. Two other quick questions, and I'll ask them both to you, let you address them. What's the relationship with, recovery communities or programs and the counseling services offered on campus? And also, what is your organization's stance on harm reduction?
Yeah, I mean, huge proponents of harm reduction. I think, um, you know, one of the individuals in this field who I look up to the most with a lot of things, but definitely with harm reduction, um, you know, when we talk about it, he mentions a bunch of different things, but he said this one quote that was, essentially, um, everyone deserves a space, and not every single space is meant for everyone. And so, largely, what we're trying to do with collegiate recovery programs, and then what the field has kind of gravitated towards overall, is providing support at a base level for students in recovery from drug and alcohol addiction. And one of our standards and recommendations was that abstinence based in that sense be kind of the standard for a number of reasons, but research based, but also in the best interest of the safety of everyone involved. Now, I think people kind of forget that this is, for me, being abstinent is the optimal form of harm reduction. For me, that's not the case for everyone else. There are other parts of the university that can, provide additional support. The communities themselves, it might not be that the exact program, the collegiate recovery program, can provide the full range of support that students needing like harm reduction services might need, but communities, the recovery communities overall, are doing a lot of that. Naloxone trainings and fentanyl test strips and working, and even 12-step overall. I mean, individuals who are still using are welcome to come. The implication or the kind of assumption is that there's a desire to stop in that sense. But yeah, there's definitely some tension between kind of we talk about abstinence, talk about harm reduction, and that comes up quite a bit in the field. But no one on our board that's elected by membership has any issue at all with harm reduction. We'd love to see more of that, and it's really great to see that it's a huge priority in the Biden-Harris administration from their drug and alcohol office. So that was that piece, the on harm reduction, and then the counseling centers and recovery programs. So collegiate recovery programs are largely non-clinical. There's definitely a lot of clinicians involved. Some are pretty clinical, but I think that's probably the main distinction, is that kind of collegiate recovery programs are more rooted in this kind of peer support, and it's not treatment. Like it is not treatment, and it's not um there again, there might be clinical components like you might kind of receive through counseling services, but more often that's complementary to what's offered from the recovery program. Like there's the involvement there, and then there are also groups or individual counseling and therapy sessions that are happening. I think when they're working in tandem, that's the best.
Well, I know that